They laughed before the race even started. Not loudly, just enough to be heard. Smirks behind visors. Casual jokes over the radio. The kind of confidence that comes from years of winning, from machines that dominate tracks and budgets that dwarf anything experimental. To them, this wasn't a contest. It was a formality. Because on paper, Maxwell Chikumbutso's car didn't belong here. No roaring engine. No legacy badge. No sponsorship logos screaming credibility. Just a quiet, unfamiliar machine rolling into position while seasoned racers adjusted gloves, already rehearsing their victory interviews. What they didn't realize was that this wasn't a race built on paper. From the moment the lights went out, something felt wrong. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just off. The usual surge from the front row didn't materialize the way it should have. Instead, there was a smooth, almost unsettling acceleration from behind. No wheel spin. No strain. Just motion, clean, controlled, relentless. By the first corner, the jokes stopped. Telemetry screens began showing numbers that didn't line up with expectations. Acceleration curves that stayed flat when they should have dipped. Energy output that didn't spike and didn't fade. The car wasn't pushing harder. It simply wasn't slowing down. Racers who had planned aggressive early moves found themselves reacting instead. Lines tightened. Braking points shifted. Small corrections turned into defensive maneuvers. And all the while, that quiet car kept closing the gap, not with drama, but with inevitability. This is where confidence starts to crack. Because racers are trained to feel machines. To sense when an opponent is overdriving, when heat will become a problem, when endurance gives way to fatigue. But this machine gave nothing away. No audible strain. No visible compromise. Lap after lap, the gap shrank. By mid-race, the humiliation wasn't loud, it was psychological. Overtakes didn't come from risky dives or desperate moves. They came on straights where speed should have equalized. On exits where traction should have been limited. Places where experience usually matters more than innovation. And that's when the realization hit. This wasn't a faster car. It was a different kind of car. One that didn't treat energy as something to burn through, but something to manage. One that didn't peak early and fade late. One that behaved less like a machine at its limit and more like a system operating comfortably below it. Veteran racers started making mistakes. Tiny ones at first. A missed apex. A late brake. The kind of errors that don't happen when confidence is intact. Because once doubt enters the cockpit, it doesn't leave quietly. And the car everyone underestimated kept advancing. Crowd reactions shifted subtly. Cheers delayed by confusion. Commentators lowering their voices, checking data feeds twice before speaking. Because no one wanted to say it out loud yet, but everyone could see it happening. The overconfident weren't losing to luck. They were being exposed. As the final laps approached, the gap wasn't just physical, it was philosophical. Old assumptions about performance, about limits, about what wins races, were being challenged in real time. Not in a lab. Not in a press release. On the track. And when the checkered flag finally waved, the silence was louder than any celebration. Helmets stayed on longer than usual. Radios crackled without words. A few racers stared at the car they'd dismissed earlier, trying to understand what they'd just been beaten by. Because losing a race is one thing. Losing certainty is something else entirely. And as teams began pulling data, replaying laps, searching for explanations, one uncomfortable truth started forming beneath the surface. This wasn't a fluke. And it wasn't the last time this would happen. Because once overconfidence meets a system designed to outlast it, the humiliation doesn't end at the finish line. And into every decision that comes after it. Back in the paddock, the atmosphere had changed. Mechanics spoke more quietly. Engineers stared longer at screens. Conversations that should have been about tire wear and fuel strategy drifted into unfamiliar territory. Energy curves, thermal stability, efficiency ratios that refused to behave the way textbooks said they should. The data didn't show spikes. That was the problem. Racing teams are trained to hunt spikes, moments of excess that can be exploited or punished. Overheating, voltage drops, mechanical fatigue. But Maxwell's car showed none of it. The lines were calm, predictable, almost boring. And boring is terrifying when you're used to chaos. One by one, excuses collapsed. It wasn't weather. Conditions were identical. It wasn't weight advantage. The numbers didn't support it. It wasn't a risky setup that paid off once. The performance had been consistent from lap 1 to the final corner. That consistency gnawed at the veterans the most. Because racing careers are built on reading limits, knowing when to push and when to hold back. But how do you read a car that never signals distress? How do you intimidate a machine that doesn't blink? Whispers began spreading through the pit lanes. Not from fans, but from engineers. They talked about system-level thinking. About a vehicle that didn't treat power, cooling, and motion as separate battles, but as a single conversation happening continuously. Adjustments not in bursts, but in micro-decisions happening faster than human reflexes could register. This wasn't brute force. It was orchestration. And orchestration changes the psychology of competition. Because when you realize your opponent isn't struggling, you start questioning your own limits instead. Push harder, and you risk mistakes. Hold back, and you fall behind anyway. There's no comfortable response. By the time post-race interviews began, the tone had shifted completely. Confidence replaced by caution. Compliments that sounded rehearsed. Praise that tried to mask unease. No one wanted to admit what they were thinking. That this race wasn't lost. It was obsolete. Because if performance can be sustained without visible sacrifice, then traditional racing strategies, push early, manage later, stop applying. The entire rhythm of competition changes. Endurance becomes baseline. Aggression loses its edge. And the humiliation deepens when you realize it wasn't personal. The car didn't target anyone. It didn't react to provocation. It simply executed its design. That realization lingered long after the track cleared. In strategy meetings. In late-night data reviews. In the uncomfortable silence when someone finally asked the question no one wanted to answer. What happens if this scales? Because racing has always been the proving ground. Technologies appear here first, then quietly migrate into consumer vehicles, fleets, and infrastructure. What humiliates professionals on a closed circuit today often reshapes everyday mobility tomorrow. And as Maxwell's team packed up, without spectacle, without celebration, the message left behind wasn't about dominance. It was about inevitability. You can laugh at a prototype. You can underestimate a system you don't understand. But once it proves itself under pressure, it doesn't ask for your respect. It takes it. And the racers who walked away that day knew something fundamental had shifted. They hadn't just been beaten. Not to relive the loss, but to understand the silence. The absence of drama. The lack of visible struggle. Because in racing, domination usually announces itself loudly. This one didn't. What unsettled competitors most wasn't the lap time, it was the margin. Not how fast Maxwell's car was, but how comfortable it looked being fast. Engineers noticed throttle traces that never spiked. Thermal readings that stayed stubbornly flat. Energy curves that behaved like they were planned, not chased. That's when the narrative quietly flipped. Instead of asking, how did it win? They started asking, why didn't it lose? Because nothing in the race suggested fragility. No moment where luck could be blamed. No corner where it nearly gave something back. It ran like a system designed to stay inside itself, never reaching for more than it needed. And that kind of design is hard to attack. Sponsors began calling. Not loudly, privately. Asking uncomfortable questions about future relevance. About whether next season's investments were aligned with where performance was actually going, or where it used to be. Racers felt it too. Confidence is currency in motorsport, and that currency had just been devalued. The next time helmets went on, there was hesitation where there hadn't been before. Because once you've seen a machine ignore pressure, you stop trusting intimidation as a strategy. Meanwhile, outside the racing world, the story started leaking into places it didn't belong. Engineering forums. Fleet optimization circles. Energy systems analysts who normally ignored motorsport suddenly paid attention. Because what happened on that track wasn't about competition, it was about control.
Control over energy.
Control over endurance. Control over uncertainty. And when systems demonstrate that kind of control under extreme conditions, people start asking what they could do under normal ones. That's where this gets bigger than racing. Because tracks are laboratories with consequences. What survives there doesn't just perform, it proves. And what proved itself that day wasn't a single innovation, but a philosophy. Performance without desperation. As other teams rushed to iterate, adding power, shaving weight, pushing limits, the uncomfortable truth loomed over every adjustment. You can't tune composure into a system that wasn't built for it. And the more they chased the result, the more they risked repeating the same mistake, mistaking intensity for superiority. Somewhere in that realization lies the real humiliation. Not losing the race, but realizing the rules you mastered no longer guarantee victory. And as whispers grow louder, as rematches are planned and confidence is publicly rebuilt, one thing remains unresolved. The next time these cars line up, will the overconfident have learned? And patterns, once established, don't need permission to repeat. As preparations for the rematch began, something curious happened. The loudest voices grew quieter. Public bravado remained, of course it did, but behind closed doors, the tone shifted from confidence to calculation. Setups became conservative. Risks were debated instead of assumed. Engineers argued not about how to win big, but how not to be exposed again. That alone spoke volumes. Because dominance doesn't just change outcomes, it changes behavior. And Maxwell's car had already begun shaping decisions before a single wheel touched the track again. In private tests, rival teams tried to recreate what they'd seen. More power, more aggressive energy deployment, smarter cooling tricks. But every attempt came with a cost. Push too hard, and stability suffered. Hold back, and pace disappeared. The balance they were chasing wasn't something you could dial in overnight. It had been designed. That realization crept in slowly, then all at once. This wasn't the machine optimized for a moment. It was optimized for continuity, for repeating performance without degradation, for treating pressure as a variable, not a threat. And that distinction matters. Because racers know something most spectators don't. The fastest lap rarely wins championships. Consistency does. Reliability does. The ability to perform under identical conditions again and again without drama. That's why the rematch carried more tension than the first race. Not because anyone expected a miracle, but because everyone feared confirmation. As the cars lined up once more, the atmosphere felt heavier. Cameras searched for reactions. Commentators filled space with speculation. But inside the cockpits, focus narrowed to a single thought. Don't let it happen again. And yet, from the opening moments, the same calm presence emerged. Not aggressive, not defensive, just there, holding pace effortlessly, refusing to be baited, letting others burn energy trying to force an advantage that never quite appeared. This is where humiliation deepens, not in being beaten, but in realizing you're the one expending effort while your opponent remains composed. Lap by lap, pressure migrated inward. Drivers pushed a little too hard. Tires protested. Small corrections stacked up. And once again, the quiet car remained unchanged by the chaos around it. No heroics. No theatrics. Just execution. By the midpoint, it was clear this wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about adaptation. About whether the old guard could recalibrate fast enough to compete with a system that didn't play by emotional rules. And as the realization spread, this time faster, sharper, the crowd began to sense it too. This wasn't a rivalry. It was a transition. Because when a new way of winning appears, it doesn't ask whether you're ready. It simply keeps showing up, race after race, forcing everyone else to decide how long they can afford to pretend nothing has changed. And as engines cooled and data poured in once more, one thought settled uncomfortably across the paddock. If this is what happens when overconfidence meets composure, what happens when composure becomes the standard? It didn't demand investigations. Because there was nothing to point at. No illegal component. No obvious violation. Just a system doing exactly what it was designed to do, over and over again. That's when the real work began. Design meetings stretched late into the night. Whiteboards filled with arrows instead of numbers. Engineers stopped asking how to extract more peak performance and started asking how to reduce volatility. How to make a car less reactive, less emotional, more patient. A word rarely used in racing suddenly appeared in serious discussions. Composure. Because composure, once you see it in action, is impossible to ignore. It's the difference between surviving pressure and being unaffected by it. And Maxwell's car hadn't just survived. It had operated as if pressure was irrelevant. That distinction spread quickly beyond the track. Manufacturers who normally dismissed racing as marketing theater began paying attention. Because racing exposes stress in ways consumer testing never can. If a system remains stable here, it's stable anywhere. Questions started flowing downstream. What would this mean for endurance events? For autonomous driving under unpredictable conditions? For fleets that can't afford downtime, mistakes, or inefficiency? And suddenly, that humiliation looked less like embarrassment and more like early evidence. Evidence that a new performance hierarchy was forming. One where brute force mattered less than coherence. Where control trumped aggression. Where energy wasn't spent, it was stewarded. That shift unsettled veterans the most. Because mastery in any field comes from internalizing rules. And when those rules change, mastery has to be rebuilt from scratch. Experience becomes memory, not advantage. As new race calendars were announced and future lineups hinted at, speculation grew. Would others catch up? Would the gap close? Or would this composure-driven philosophy widen the separation even further? The truth is, no one knew yet. But one thing was clear. Whatever happened next, no one would ever underestimate a quiet car again. Because confidence that isn't earned becomes visible the moment it's challenged. And systems designed to endure don't need to prove themselves loudly. They simply keep showing up, unchanged, until disbelief runs out of places to hide. And somewhere between the data sheets and the grandstands, a realization began to settle in. This wasn't the end of a rivalry. And once the game moves on, it doesn't look back. By the end of the season, the race that once drew laughter had become a reference point. Not a scandal, not a controversy, a case study. Teams spoke about it in measured tones, careful not to sound offensive, careful not to admit how deeply it had unsettled them. Because what Maxwell Chikumbutso's car revealed wasn't just superior performance. It revealed a blind spot, a reliance on aggression where balance mattered more, a belief that dominance had to be loud to be real, a confidence built on past victories, not future readiness. That confidence didn't just lose a race. It lost relevance. The quiet car didn't rewrite the rulebook. It exposed which pages everyone else had stopped reading. It showed that endurance beats intensity, that composure beats bravado, and that systems built to last don't need to announce themselves. They simply arrive. And as competitors scrambled to adapt, the real humiliation wasn't being overtaken on the track. It was realizing that the advantage they trusted had already expired. Because when innovation stops chasing the spotlight and starts designing for inevitability, the outcome is no longer dramatic. It's unavoidable. So the next time laughter echoes at the starting line, it will carry a different tone. Less certainty, more caution. Because now everyone knows what happens when overconfidence meets a system that doesn't blink. The race didn't end at the checkered flag. It ended the moment certainty cracked.